For most people, the map of Africa looks completely normal. 54 countries, each separated by clear borders. Lines that appear permanent, almost natural, as if they had always existed. But if you stare at those lines for just a little longer, something strange begins to appear. Many of them are perfectly straight. They slice across deserts, forests, mountains, and rivers, as if someone simply placed a ruler on the continent and drew lines without ever touching the land. No mountain, no river, no tribe, nothing stood in their way. They were drawn thousands of kilometers away, inside a room in Europe, by men who had never set foot on the continent. To understand how this happened, we have to travel back more than a century. The year was 1884. Europe was in the midst of an unprecedented scramble, a race to claim the vast lands of Africa, a continent full of resources, rich soils, and rivers that had fed civilizations for thousands of years. But the people who lived there? They had no say. Not a single voice would be heard inside the room where history was being rewritten. Inside that conference hall, maps were laid out, rulers were placed, and lines were drawn with precision. Mountains, rivers, deserts, none of them mattered. Entire communities were split in the sweep of a straight line, their lives forever altered by a pen held thousands of kilometers away. Why would these men care so little about the people who had called these lands home for generations? How could a simple line on paper hold such power? Some borders followed natural features, the Nile, the Congo, the Atlas Mountains, but most were completely arbitrary. A line could cut through forests where tribes hunted, rivers that had been lifelines for centuries, and mountains that marked sacred grounds. And yet, these lines became law. By the time the conference ended, Africa had been divided like a chessboard. Every European power had its slice, some large, some tiny, but all designed to maximize profit and strategic advantage. Could you imagine living in a land where your neighbors, your rivals, your allies were decided by strangers thousands of miles away? How would it feel to have your life dictated by lines on a map? And this was only the beginning, because even after the ink dried, the consequences would ripple for decades, shaping conflicts, trade, culture, and the very identity of entire nations. As the lines spread across Africa, the reality on the ground was ignored. Tribes who had coexisted for centuries were suddenly divided. Families found themselves in different countries, trade routes were cut in half, alliances shattered overnight. Some borders cut straight through fertile lands, forcing communities to adapt or perish. Rivers that had provided water, food, and transport for generations were suddenly shared or controlled by foreign powers. Imagine waking up one morning to find that the land your ancestors had farmed for centuries now belonged to someone else, across an invisible line drawn with no consultation. Europeans debated resources as if they were pieces on a chessboard. Gold, rubber, ivory, and fertile soil became bargaining chips. And while they argued over wealth and influence, the people of Africa were considered irrelevant, mere footnotes on a map. Have you ever wondered how it would feel to be erased on paper? To see your homeland treated like a commodity, your history dismissed, your culture overlooked? Even today, those arbitrary decisions cast long shadows. Cities divided by borders, communities struggling to reconnect, conflicts rooted in lines that were drawn without thought. Could things have been different if those lines had followed nature or respected the people living there? But the European powers didn't care. They celebrated their civilized solutions, believing their maps were a mark of order, progress, and civilization. Yet in reality, The maps ignored the people who had lived there for centuries, people who had built thriving societies, rich in culture and knowledge. And this raises the question, when power is concentrated in the hands of a few, far from those affected, what is the cost? Could one room in Europe, filled with maps and rulers, really dictate the lives of millions across an entire continent? Many of the straight borders ignored the continent's natural geography entirely. Deserts were crossed, rivers bisected, and mountains cut cleanly in two. Entire cultures were split, sometimes forcing enemies to live under the same rule, or friends to live in different countries. Take the Congo, for example. A vast river network had sustained countless communities for centuries. Yet it became a resource for foreign powers, its people subjected to exploitation and forced labour. The borders on the map didn't reflect reality, they reflected ambition. And in West Africa, lines divided powerful kingdoms without warning. People who had traded, intermarried, and coexisted suddenly found themselves under different laws, different rulers, different taxes. Confusion, tension, and resistance became inevitable. Have you ever stopped to think how these arbitrary lines could ignite decades of conflict? Every straight line on the map was more than just ink. It was a seed of future wars, migrations, and upheavals. Meanwhile, European powers celebrated their mastery of Africa. They believed they were bringing civilization, order, and progress. But what they failed to see was that progress built on someone else's suffering leaves a shadow that lasts centuries. And this shadow is still visible today. Borders may appear permanent, but the stories behind them tell a different tale, one of displacement, struggle, and adaptation. Can you imagine the resilience it must have taken for communities to survive such sudden, imposed change? Even more shocking is that some of these borders were chosen purely for strategic convenience. A river, a mountain, or a forest was ignored if it didn't suit the European agenda. Nature itself was sidelined. How different might Africa's map look if those lines had followed rivers, mountains, or the natural paths of the people who lived there? In North Africa, the Sahara stretches endlessly, a natural barrier that could have defined borders. Yet Europeans drew straight lines across it, ignoring the people who had navigated and thrived there for generations. Tribes that had traded for centuries suddenly found themselves in different countries, strangers where they had once been neighbours. In West Africa, kingdoms that had once been powerful were split apart. Communities that shared markets, festivals, and sacred lands were separated overnight. Have you ever wondered how it would feel to have your cultural heritage divided like that? To find yourself in a country where your language, your traditions, or even your family ties no longer matched the laws of the land. Meanwhile, in Central Africa, the Congo River was turned into a tool of exploitation. European powers treated the river not as a lifeline for its people, but as a path to drain the wealth of the land. Rivers that had sustained life for millennia became channels of control, commerce, and sometimes cruelty. And yet, African communities did not simply vanish. They adapted. They resisted. They found ways to preserve their culture, their trade, their identity. But each straight line drawn on the map left scars, scars that would echo across generations. Have you ever thought about how a line, invisible to the naked eye but powerful on paper, could shape entire nations? Could a map truly have more power than the people who live on it? By the late 19th century, the continent had been divided with ruthless efficiency. Borders were drawn for profit, for power, and for politics, not for the people. And every decision in that room in Europe had consequences that no ruler could foresee. Even today, conflicts, migrations, and disputes can often be traced back to those lines. Borders may seem permanent, but the history behind them is anything but natural. And it raises a question we rarely ask ourselves. How much of our modern world is shaped by decisions made far away, by people who never lived where the consequences fall? In East Africa, the Great Rift Valley runs like a scar through the land, a natural marker that could have guided borders. But European powers ignored it. Straight lines cut through fertile highlands and remote valleys, splitting tribes and disrupting trade routes that had existed for centuries. Imagine waking up one day to find that your farmland is now in another country, your neighbours suddenly under foreign rule, and your markets controlled by people who had never set foot in your land. How would you react? How far would you go to preserve your way of life? Even the wildlife felt the impact indirectly. New borders changed how lands were used, which forests were cleared, and which rivers were redirected. Entire ecosystems were affected by decisions made thousands of kilometers away, the ripple effects of human ambition reaching even into nature. In southern Africa, kingdoms like the Zulu were forced into arrangements they could not control. Territories were taken, split, or given to others, sowing seeds of tension that would last for decades. Wars broke out not just because of ambition, but because the people affected had no voice in the lines being drawn. And yet, despite the chaos, Africa's communities showed remarkable resilience. They adapted to the imposed borders, finding ways to survive, communicate, and even thrive under the new order. But the question remains, how much potential was lost? How many conflicts, migrations, and struggles could have been avoided if lines had respected nature, culture, and human life? As you watch these maps, it becomes clear. These borders are more than lines. They are symbols of a history written without consent, a history that continues to influence Africa today. And you have to wonder, if something as simple as a straight line can shape centuries of life, what does that say about the power of maps and the decisions behind them? Inside that room in Europe, the men at the table weren't thinking about rivers, mountains, or tribes. They were thinking about power, wealth, influence. Who would control trade routes? Who would extract gold, ivory, and other resources most efficiently? Maps were more than paper. They were weapons of strategy. Lines were drawn with precision, often to prevent one European power from gaining too much advantage over another. Entire communities were mere pawns in this game of empire. Have you ever wondered how something so distant could have such an immediate impact on people you've never met? How could a single room in Berlin decide the fate of millions across an entire continent? Some lines were compromises, drawn to keep rival powers satisfied. Others were bold assertions, ignoring local realities entirely. Rivers that had been lifelines for centuries were crossed, mountains bypassed, and fertile lands handed to distant kings. And yet, in Europe, it was hailed as diplomacy, progress, and order. And the consequences? They were devastating. Arbitrary borders sowed conflict almost immediately. Wars erupted, rebellions flared, and mistrust grew between communities that had once coexisted peacefully. The ink on the map became a force that shaped centuries of struggle. Even today, the echoes of that room in Europe remain. Borders that look natural on a modern map were anything but. They were lines of ambition, greed, and sometimes sheer indifference to human life. So, we have to ask, when power is exercised far from the people it affects, what are the consequences? Can maps ever be neutral? Or are they always tools of control, shaping lives in ways most of us never stop to consider? In West Africa, the borders carved out by European powers didn't respect kingdoms, clans, or trade networks. People who had lived together for generations suddenly found themselves in different countries, governed by laws they did not understand and rulers they had never chosen. Some communities resisted, others tried to adapt. Markets that had flourished for centuries had to adjust to new currencies, tariffs, and rules. Families were split, and cultural traditions were challenged. How would you cope if your home, your neighbours, and your way of life were all altered overnight by people who had never stepped foot in your land? In Central Africa, the Congo River became a lifeline controlled by foreign powers. Entire societies were subjected to forced labour, and European rulers justified it as civilization. Rivers that had sustained life for generations were transformed into channels of exploitation. And yet, the people survived. They adapted, hid, resisted, and in many ways, continued their lives despite impossible conditions. In East Africa, communities along the Great Rift Valley faced similar upheavals. Fertile highlands were claimed, pastures were divided, and disputes between tribes intensified because a line on a map did not reflect centuries of human relationships. And it wasn't just people who were affected. Forests, rivers, and wildlife were altered too. Lands that had been preserved by local communities for centuries were suddenly exploited for resources, cutting into ecosystems that had thrived for millennia. How often do we forget that human decisions can ripple through both society and nature at the same time? Even today, these borders shape the continent. Conflicts, migrations, and economic challenges can often be traced back to the lines drawn in that distant European room. Could Africa have developed differently if its borders had respected its geography and people? Every line tells a story, every border holds a secret, and every secret is a reminder of how distant decisions can shape lives in ways we rarely imagine. Over the decades, the lines drawn in that European room shaped more than maps. They shaped history itself. Wars erupted along borders that had no natural justification. Communities were forced to navigate rules they did not create in lands they had always called home. And yet, Africans did not simply submit. They resisted in countless ways. Some formed rebellions, others adapted their trade networks, their farming, their communities. Even under impossible circumstances, life found a way. Have you ever wondered how resilience works in the face of imposed order? How people survive and even thrive when the rules of the land are rewritten without their consent? Borders that had been drawn for convenience became catalysts for creativity. Communities developed new strategies to survive. Language, culture, and trade adapted, and sometimes flourished, even under foreign-imposed divisions. But the legacy of those arbitrary lines is still with us. Political tension, economic inequality, and cultural fragmentation can often be traced back to maps, rulers, and pens far away from the people affected. How much of modern Africa is shaped by the choices of men who never saw it with their own eyes? And it raises a chilling question. If simple lines can reshape the destiny of millions, what other parts of our world have been silently shaped in the same way? What consequences are still unfolding, unnoticed, because someone drew a line without understanding the land or its people? Even today, we see the echoes. Cities split, trade routes disrupted, communities navigating borders that were never their own. The past isn't gone. It whispers through rivers, deserts, and mountains, through markets, families, and traditions. It reminds us that history is not just recorded, it's lived every day. Today, those lines still define nations. Cities, towns, and villages follow borders drawn over a century ago. Yet the people living within them often feel the invisible tension of history. Conflicts, migrations, and disputes can often be traced back to a room in Europe, where maps were more important than human lives. Economic inequalities across regions are another legacy. Some communities inherited fertile lands or rich resources, Others were left with deserts or isolated highlands. Did these lines decide who would prosper and who would struggle? Could Africa's development have followed a different path if borders had respected nature and culture? Yet, African nations and communities have adapted. Despite arbitrary divisions, they created governments, trade networks, and alliances that defy the limitations imposed on them. People crossed borders, maintained cultural ties, and rebuilt what was broken. Their resilience is a testament to the human spirit. And still, questions remain. How would Africa look if the continent had been allowed to define itself? How many cultures, communities, and ecosystems were altered forever? Could lines on a map really hold such power? Even in modern cities, markets, and schools, echoes of those straight lines are visible. Rivers, roads, and even local politics are shaped by decisions made thousands of kilometers away. Decisions that once seemed abstract, but continue to influence real lives. Have you ever wondered what other stories hide behind maps? How many other regions of the world are shaped by unseen hands? By people who never lived there, but decided the fate of millions? And as we look at Africa today, it becomes clear. These borders are not just divisions of land. They are markers of history, ambition, and resilience. And the story is far from over. As we step back and look at the continent today, it's tempting to see only borders, only countries, only lines on a map. But the truth is far more profound. Every line tells a story of ambition, of power, of decisions made far from the land itself. The maps drawn in that distant room in Europe were more than political tools. They shaped the destiny of millions. They determined who would have wealth, who would face hardship, who would survive, and who would struggle for centuries to come. And yet, amid the imposed divisions, life persisted. Communities adapted, cultures survived, rivers still flow, mountains still stand, forests still whisper the stories of those who lived and thrived long before any line was drawn. Have you ever stopped to consider the power of human decisions? How a single moment, a single act, can ripple across continents and centuries? How the choices of a few can alter the lives of millions? And yet, how the resilience of the many can endure and even flourish? Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: borders may define land, but they cannot define spirit. Lines on a map may control territory, but they cannot erase history, culture, or resilience. So the next time you look at a map, pause, look closer. Ask yourself, who drew these lines? Who decided this world? And what stories are hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered? Because the truth is, Africa's story is far from complete. And every line, every border, every shadow of history is a reminder that the past is alive, whispering in the rivers, forests, and mountains, calling us to look deeper, to question, and to marvel. There are more stories hidden in our world. Subscribe to Tayron and see what others don't.